Chief editor of the series Intersections, thanks to everyone at Brill Publishers, especially Ivo Romein, thanks to Sandrine de Jong and Antina Hartmann of Leiden University. And I would like to start with an item that was in the international use only a few weeks ago. At a moment when the Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny was arrested, entering Russia, he made a brilliant counter-move. He released a documentary of 2 hours where he accused his rival, President Putin, of having built the most expensive palace of the world. In the video, we see, among others, a luxurious theater hall and a neoclassical swimming pool. Putin reacted swiftly on Navalny's accusations by stating that this was not his property, but by one of his friends. Moreover, it was not a palace, but a hotel. However, one of the images must have been very inconvenient for Putin. We see the president grim-faced. Behind him, he has a halo that shows striking similarities with a famous portrait of the French king Louis XIV, when he presented himself in a ballet as the sun. The link with Louis XIV was not meant as a compliment, but pointed at the royal allures the president claimed. It defined Putin as extravagant and decadent. It compared his palace to Versailles. However, the comparison is far more problematic than the makers of the video realize. In the 17th century, the concept of magnificence was prominent in political and economic debates. The concept defined the big spending of kings and other rulers as a virtue. Whereas Putin was condemned for constructing the palace, Louis XIV was praised for having built Versailles. 17th century authors praise the French king for his magnum facere, literally making grandness. Building Versailles was Louis's duty as a monarch. In our book on magnificence, we have tried to come to better understanding of what modern man has no longer in common with people that lived in the 17th century. It is important to fully understand differences throughout time, such as the appreciation of spending enormous amounts of money for the construction of a palace. The editors and authors of this book hope that our book is a new step in the right direction of further historical understanding of big spending. So let me introduce Gijs Versteegen, one of the editors of this book. He will provide us with some insights of the book's origins. Gijs is a historian of the early modern Spanish court and works at the Universidad Rey Juan Carlos. Gijs, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Stijn, for your presentation. The idea to organize a conference and to edit a volume on magnificence started in 2017 in Leiden. I was there with a colleague of mine, José Eloy Hortal Muñoz, and he suggested me to meet Stijn Bussels. At the time, Eloy and I were working on a project on the Spanish royal sites, and I focused my part of the research on the discourse on magnificence in Spanish courtly literature. And as we knew that Stijn had been working on magnificence and the sublime, we thought it would be a good idea to get together and to interchange some ideas. So on a grey afternoon in July, we met in a cafe in Leiden. We had a couple of beers and a very pleasant conversation. And we immediately connected because of our interest in the early modern reception of classical thought. Stijn from the perspective of art theory, and I because I focused on that topic in relation to courtly political and moral discourse. I remember we came up with a lot of ideas and ended the afternoon with the plan to organize a conference in Madrid on magnificence. Many plans remain vague promises, but in August I already received several mails by Stijn, and from that moment on we worked closely together. Stijn proposed to elaborate on the concept of magnificence, taking the etymological origin of the word as a starting point, magnum facere, which refers to the fact that magnificence is first and foremost an action, a performance. Magnificence as a virtue acquired its significance in practice. And from the beginning, Stijn got in touch with Walter Melion, who enthusiastically supported our plans to publish a volume on magnificence in the Intersections series, exploring the relation between ethics and aesthetics. Meanwhile, we received institutional support from the Leiden University, from the Universidad Rey Juan Carlos, but also from the Instituto MOL, a Spanish Research Center on Flemish Painting, and from Lucas, the Leiden University Center for the Study of the Arts in Society, and from two research projects headed by Felix Labrador, La Herencia de los Sitios Reales, Madrid de Corta Capital, and Del Patrimonio Dinástico al Patrimonio Nacional, Los Sitios Reales. The conference took place in March 2019 in Madrid, and I remember these were one of the first beautiful days in spring in Madrid, and the parks were full of people and enjoying the sun. And we spent on a very fruitful discussion about the different ways of performing magnificence in Catholic and Protestant Europe. Thanks to Ana Diegues, who was also one of the organizers of the conference and participated in the conference, but she also turned out to be an excellent manager of public relations. We got a lot of media coverage and news articles, and a chronicle and an interview appeared in more than 20 newspapers in Spain. But of course, the importance was the debate on magnificence with researchers from many different fields, literary history, art history, philosophy, performance studies, the history of theater and dance, and well, a lot of different points of view. But in spite of these differences, we had a common ground. And in the discussion, each time we returned to Aristotle's definition of magnificence as the art of spending lavishly in a way that is fitting to the agent, according to the circumstances, and focusing on the golden mean, trying to avoid the extremes of avarice and extravagance. And precisely this circumstantial condition of magnificence, which explains its adaptability to different cultural, religious, and historical contexts, made this debate so fascinating. To finish, in addition to Stijn, I would like to express my gratitude to Guido Garzoni and to Nafsika Atanasuli for participating in the book launch. And I also would like to thank, on behalf of all the editors and the authors, the great work done by the copy editors Vera van Bedaf and Ivo Romein, responsible for the final drafts of the text and the images. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gijs. I also remember that directly after we had a drink together, I had dinner with Walter, so we could directly make plans. But so our next speaker is the third editor, Walter. Walter Melion is a professor of art history at Emory University in Atlanta and has published widely on Dutch and Flemish art and art theory of the 16th and 17th centuries, on Jesuit image theory, and on the relation between theology and aesthetics. Very recently, he has become the president of the Historians of Netherlandish Art. So we'll meet again on a different occasion. Walter, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. It was a great privilege to work on this project. And I was the third editor as a representative of the Board of Intersections. And Intersections is a series published by Brill. The editor-in-chief is Carlin Enkel, that embraces multidisciplinary projects. And this was one of the things that so impressed me about Stijn's and Gijs's Magnificenza volume, And what I wanted to summarize is just a few of the things I took from working on the volume. I did not actually contribute an essay. I simply functioned as an editor, but I was fascinated to learn about the philosophical foundation of the notion of magnificence and benefited greatly. I'm just going to mention 5 of the articles. I thought the entire book was splendid, but I benefited greatly from Matthias Royk's article in which he explains how and why magnificence was construed as a moral virtue, and on the basis of a close reading of the Nicomachean Ethics, and then distinguishes between understanding and erudition, magnificence and liberality, and the philosopher and the philologist, all as a way of showing how nuanced people's experience and articulation of magnificence was in the 16th, 17th, and I would say even the early 18th centuries. So there was a philosophical account of magnificence in the volume, and I was equally interested in the literary studies on magnificence, and especially what I take to be almost a kind of closing article to the volume in the sense, and here I'm thinking about Klaas Tindemans' marvelous article on John Wilmot's Lucina's rape, in which he shows how, in the context of the latest 17th century English court, magnificence is understood as dissimulation. It is no longer a licit form of simulation or a licit form of staging one's moral virtue, but it is disenchanted and explains what the process of that disenchantment of magnificence is and why it can no longer function within a certain political context as a moral virtue. And so in a way, the book is bracketed by a clear definition, Aristotelian definition of magnificence as moral virtue, and an article that shows how it ceases to be able, how it loses that function, how it ceases to be able to function as a moral virtue. And then there was so much material that just was illuminating to me, and not least Elizabeth Den Hartog's article, whereas most of the articles were talking about magnificence as an instrument of, let's call it, in Stephen Greenblatt's usage, self-fashioning. Hartog was talking about an instance of magnificence which is not about self-fashioning, but about representing the magnificence of someone or an entity that is the United Province that had lost its political authority and its prestige as a function of the French invasion and the French capture of the city of Utrecht. And that article, which shows how gardens might be construed an expression of magnificence, was really very, very fascinating to me. And then there was the very marvelous article by Madeleine Goulet that talked about competing notions of magnificence that enter into a kind of conversation with each other: French and papal, Italian princely magnificence, and magnificence of a member of an extremely old French aristocratic family. What happens when two representatives of two different systems or regimes of magnificence get married? How do they reconcile these two systems of magnificence? And what are the different functions of the ceremonial magnificence they stage, both at Versailles and Rome? And then finally, just to mention one more, but as I said, all of the articles I thought were splendid. It was a very consistent volume in that respect. I learned an enormous amount from Miniati's article about the royal exequies stage in Milan. And one of the things that fascinated me is you can see that there's a real distinction between exemplifying the magnificence of the city of Milan and representing royal magnificence through personification. So you don't personify the magnificence of Milan, but that you've staged a magnificent apparato that incorporates personifications of the magnificence of Elizabeth of France, and then later for the exequies of Philip IV. Philip IV declares their magnificence. So it's exemplification is one mode of staging magnificence, and personification is another mode of staging magnificence. And in these ceremonial exequies, both modes are working simultaneously. So one of the things I took from the volume is that magnificence has multiple modalities. And all of these modalities are contingent in interesting ways, but they all play upon each other. And finally, when I was a graduate student, we were still reading Fête de la Renaissance, Jacot's great volume, and thinking about courtly spectacle and its functions. And we were reading closely the work of Elizabeth McGrath and Francis Yates that in a very subtle way explained what the functions of ceremonial spectacle are. But what we needed, and Patricia Waddy does this too in her book on princely palaces in Rome, especially when she talks about the function of the ceremonial enfilade. And so there was this rich art historical and social historical discourse on spectacle and festivity. But what we needed was a book like Magnificenza to explain to us how this critical category of magnificence operates in and through the apparatus of spectacle and the ceremonial of public festivity. So congratulations to Stijn, and congratulations to Gijs, and congratulations to all of you, the contributors to this magnificent volume, which we're very proud to have in the Intersections series.
We were very happy to have you as the third editor, because you also did a great job by having that view from more outside to reflect on the contributions and to make them even better than they were in previous drafts. So thank you very much, Walter. We invited Nafsika Athanasoulis to reflect on our book, as she is a most respected expert in the use of the concept megaloplepeia or magnificentia from Aristotle onwards. Especially her essay, A Defense of the Aristotelian Virtue of Magnificence, published in 2016 in the journal Value Inquiry, was very influential for our book. Nafsika, thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for wanting to review our book. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you all, the authors and the editors, for introducing me to this wonderful book. I thoroughly and genuinely enjoyed reading it. I would very much like to spend time on each of the individual contributions, because I think they all deserve our individual attention. But given the time constraints, I thought I might talk about some themes that I saw in the book, because I was quite surprised and gratified to see that the book was very philosophical, and there were some strong philosophical threads running through all the contributions to the volume, which I found very exciting. And I thought there's loads of ideas here for how things could progress in the future and for more work to be done on this topic. So I wanted to talk about those threads and maybe suggest in the end about more work that could be done, so that if you have another conference, it would be lovely to meet up and talk. I am slightly jealous I missed the Madrid conference in the sunshine of the spring, but hopefully things will get better around the world and there'll be another conference maybe next year. Okay, so for philosophers, magnificence is really an embarrassing virtue. We don't really talk a lot about it when you tend to teach the Nicomachean Ethics and you get to the long list of all the virtues. Everybody concentrates on courage. Courage is a really easy one because intuitively everybody understands that you can have the emotion of fear, and too much fear is going to be a vice. You're going to be a coward. Too little fear is also going to be a vice. You're going to be rash, but the appropriate mean is found encouraged, just the right amount of fear for the situation. And this is the most discussed virtue because it's just easy for people to understand what Aristotle is talking about. Justice is a very interesting virtue because once you've introduced everybody to the mean, justice doesn't quite fit in. So there's quite a lot of good ideas there into how to adjust Aristotle's ideas of justice and how to make them compatible with the mean. Then by the time you get to magnanimity, you kind of say to everybody, well, look, this sounds really weird, but you have to understand the context within which Aristotle was talking. You have a society where honor was very important. So within that context, this is not a self-regarding virtue. You're not being particularly selfish or self-centered when you're saying that you are magnanimous. You're actually expressing one of the values of that particular society of having been honorable and acknowledging that you are honorable. And magnificence is completely ignored. If you are an Aristotelian, you're a bit embarrassed by magnificence because it's considered an Aristotelian mistake. I think, although this is just a supposition, this comes because of Bertrand Russell, who in his History of Philosophy kind of said that magnificence is a terrible mistake that Aristotle made. And this kind of followed on the decades after that. Everybody has had this impression that along with slavery, along with misogyny, magnificence is the third of Aristotle's big mistakes. If you're an Aristotelian, you might forgive him his mistakes. And if you're somebody who objects to virtue ethics and Aristotle, you're going to smirk and point at magnificence to show how we all got it wrong and annoy us. My own work on magnificence is entirely coincidental. And I say this to show to you how little philosophers are interested in magnificence. About 20 years ago, in my PhD dissertation, I wrote 2 or 3 sentences about how there must be more to magnificence than this quick dismissal. And that was it. My external said, this sounds really good, you should write more on this. But it took 15 years for me to write the one paper that I have actually written on magnificence. I think there's only, if you do a Google search in philosophy and magnificence, you're only going to get a couple of hits. But this collection shows why this is a huge, huge mistake. There is so much we can learn from this examination of magnificence in the 17th century, and so many perspectives that are revealed to us by these contributions. I think philosophers need to go back and pay the virtue of magnificence more attention. So one of the main reasons why magnificence is never mentioned in philosophical circles is the charge of elitism. If you're a moral philosopher and you're interested in presenting a convincing moral theory, you're trying to answer questions like, what kind of person should I be? How should I behave? How should I live my life? What is the right thing to do here? And those kinds of answers that you give ought to be open to everybody, because morality captures our more important values and beliefs, and our moral actions express our characters and our most deeply held convictions. Now imagine if that was the case, and I said that most of you cannot be moral at all because you don't have an enormous amount of money. Now that seems really problematic. How could it be that the moral life requires large amounts of wealth? Surely Aristotle got it wrong. That is the main reason why magnificence is rejected as a fundamental part of the good life. But I think this is a misrepresentation of what magnificence is that becomes very clear when you read the contributions to this volume. A large number of authors in this volume show, with different case studies and from different perspectives, how magnificence is a virtue linked to those in a special position. So this could be monarchs or political leaders, dukes or religious leaders, but magnificence is always an expression of their status. That makes it a limited virtue, but this is not problematic because it's not a limited virtue which excludes, but it's a limited virtue which pulls in the people who happen to find themselves in this position. If you have a particular status of privilege, this generates in itself an obligation. And we have in the volume a lot of examples of this kind of link between status and magnificence. We have contributions that highlight kings whose magnificence is an expression of their royal status as outranking everybody else, or possibly even their status as favored by God. We have expressions of magnificence as a need to express political power, a void that was created because military glory is no longer a possibility. So one of the new ways of expressing political power is magnificence. We have even depictions of the royal households, which functioned as a seat of political and diplomatic power through ceremonial and etiquette aspects of magnificence. We have contributions on how one ought to cultivate magnificence and how it's part of education as a special responsibility of those who are wealthy to bring up their children in a particular way to become magnificent. And even as the proper expression of wealth in times of religious and fiscal humility. Even when it's inappropriate to have wealth and to spend wealth, magnificence is an exception because of the status of the person making the magnificent contribution and because of the goal of magnificence. So that gives us a huge number of examples of how magnificence can be expressed through various different conceptions of the special status of the person. We even have one contribution that shows what happens when you lose your status. Magnificence is so central to the expression of power that when the political and cultural power begins to fade, as it did for the Stuarts, the manifestation of this is an attack on magnificence. The two go hand in hand. Now, another reason why philosophers tend to dismiss magnificence is because they think it's very limited in its relevance. They tend to think that it only made sense within the social cultural situation of the ancient Greek polis, and that it was limited in the expression of liturgies, a conception and a practice that we no longer have, and since liturgies are obscure, magnificence makes no sense. But I think this is another very fundamental contribution of this collection. It shows us that magnificence can be expressed centuries after Aristotle in a huge variety of ways. Even a layperson, someone completely outside the history of art like myself, can look at a church and imagine that this could be an expression of magnificence. The churches and halls, town halls, are perhaps more evident examples of magnificence. But we have in the book also detailed accounts of how ceremonies can be expressions of magnificence. Celebrations of births and baptisms, marriages, even commemorations of the deceased and their life. Of course, examples of art and paintings, but equally examples of magnificent plays, which include drama, dance, and music. And even, of course, the most wonderful of all, the magnificent garden of rare plants. I mean, as an outsider to this discussion, what a wonderful example. It just brought a smile to my face that there could be an expression of magnificence in gardening, in plants. And this is such a wonderful illustration of the fundamental Aristotelian idea that the flourishing life is not one thing for everybody. The flourishing life has to be an expression of that individual in their position in the life that they're leading at that moment. So the flourishing life is, in a sense, constructed by that individual's conception of the noble and the good in the society they find themselves in, with the demands that it imposes on them. Sometimes at church, sometimes a celebration of the birth of a child, sometimes a garden of rare plants. So instead of being irrelevant, I think this volume showcases both the diverse conceptions of magnificence and its relevance in different social contexts. And it shines a light on how we should look at magnificence in contemporary terms. Instead of dismissing it as an outdated mistake made a long time ago, if we recognize that magnificence had this important and very diverse role in the 17th century, could we not maybe ask what could be the role of magnificence in the context in which we live in? We have a world that's facing climate catastrophe. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Couldn't there be different expressions of magnificence? If magnificence can be expressed in a garden of rare plants, could it not also be expressed in clean water for people who don't have access to clean water, or to a vaccine to end a a pandemic. Because all that unites all these different expressions of magnificence is that they're all targeted towards the noble and the good, whether this is interpreted as benefiting the common good of a community, or divine worship, or royal admiration, or political authority. I think there's definitely a lot to be learned from reconsidering magnificence in all of its contexts, the Aristotelian, 17th century, and even now.
Thank you so much, Nausicaa, for not only giving a very nice view, your own view on the book, but also on looking to the future and look at new steps to be taken with that Aristotelian concept of megaloprepeia, magnificence. Our last speaker is Guido Guerzoni, professor and researcher in economic history at Bocconi University. He has published widely on the history of cultural institutions and art markets and the history of culture. Our book has gratefully used his essay, Liberalitas Magnificentia Splendor, the classic origins of Italian Renaissance lifestyles. Guido, we really appreciate if you are willing to review our book today. The floor is yours.
Thanks. The article you mentioned brought me back to another period of my life, because I began my research in 1994, so more than 25 years ago. And your invitation is an occasion to reflect about what happened in these almost 3 decades. At that time, magnificence was a topic mostly practiced by intellectual historians. Art historians met, and Walter mentioned Astrea, and I remember Roy Strong. So there were few art historians who were just investigating the dimension of magnificence, not on a functional level. 30 years later, the reason why I found extremely interesting and foundational your book is represented by the next steps that historical researchers could take, exploiting the ways you have indicated in your book. And I'm referring in my short speech about 3 different, promising points of, development. The first is the political awareness about magnificence. It was not only a moral virtue, but was the theoretical framework which motivated the assumption of decision taken on a daily basis. And referring to the article focus on architecture and festivals or ephemera, apologies if I'm just going to write some example, but it's important to want to remain in my time. What struck me is that there is a clear correlation between the beginning of some architectural cycles and a precise moment of political turmoil. So architectural magnificent patronage was not random, was not given by an individual as well as celebrity choice, but is the result of a precise political calculation. And the number of individuals involved, again on a daily basis, in this process is fairly astonishing. We're talking some frequently about thousands of individuals which were able to eat every day thanks to this project. Even when we deal with ephemera, the Gonzaga court were able to spend 20% of their own yearly budget in one ephemera. So what we have to reconsider is the redistributive effect of magnificent expense. Because in certain Italian dukedoms, almost 50% of the whole state budget was represented by expenses which could today refer as magnificent expenses. But they were the engine which makes the economic wheel going and rotate. They were able to speed up the velocity of monetary circulation, for instance. So on one side, we have the theoretical justification of this expense. On the other hand, we have to study with the same attention what happened on a more practical level. So there is not only a matter of propaganda or the political display, but politics as some practical basic ground. And this ground were based on the money spent through this process. Otherwise, we can't understand, the resistance of these spending models over time, and the sincere enthusiasm or collective consensus was not based only on the political suggestion, but was based on, the real benefit that many families in the city, in the capital, were taking from, being the protagonists on the lower level of the spectacles or on this yard. I could mention one of the Italian historians that I most admire, which was Carlo Maria Cipolla. Carlo Maria Cipolla was not notoriously fond of hyperbole, but he gave a precise response when he said that the examples of public works start in the 17th century. In order to counteract bouts of unemployment are so abundant that there is only the difficulty of choice. So 95% of new building, building yards enterprise open by courts and republics in Italian 17th century, but I presume that the same discourse might hold true even for other regional contexts, is normally due to a reaction to a period of economic difficulty. So we can't detach the centrality of the Magnificent debate with the role played by this kind of expense in order to try to solve unemployment, for instance. And the rulers at the time, they were perfectly aware about the political meaning of the art. There is a famous treatise writer, Giovan Battista Armenini, that describing this, building phrasiness, stated that it seemed that all Christianity is competing to make very beautiful temples, chapels, and monasteries, took into account this aspect too, and display extremely concrete forms of piety. So it was a way to redistribute, wealth, and to offer sometime, a survivance or a survival strategy. The second point that Nafsika told, and I see a dog, and my dog is with me, so then we could share part of our pets. This is an Italian hound, so I see a Siamese cat. So we have historians, intellectuals, plus pets, and so as part of this audience, we can't avoid to mention our, friends of sons or daughters, according to the different, family ideas. When we're talking about magnificence, we don't have to forget that the debates about the discourse and the debate about liberality in certain countries was even more important. So it's true, magnificence regards only few individuals with some status. But for instance, in Italy, probably is more interesting the debate about liberality and, which is the second point that I want to mention, social emulation. So magnificent through liberality impose certain, role models or spending models, which became, the topic of another interesting debate, which is social emulatio. And emulatio was considered extremely negative in terms of, it was able to disgregate society because, and here I could quote a couple marvelous examples. Thanks to liberality, the artisans wants to be equal to the citizen to the gentleman to the title, and this last to the prince. These are things too far beyond reason and measure and intolerable that displeased God and led to 1,000 sins. When we look closely at the consumption models of early modern and 16th and 17th century European cities or cultures, we can't forget the role played by the dissemination of liberal model, and the impact that it has in terms of looking for novelties, of introducing new products or introducing imitations. I've been working for years about imitations. I mean, legal. They were not, fakes. People were aware that they were going to buy things of different quality. But in the Italian society, and probably even in the Dutch one, the different layers of qualities of object is astonishing. So today we're not able to recognize that there were 7 different types of black velvet, but in Genoa they were producing 6 different types, and an educated eye was able to distinguish the difference between black velvet. So today we are unable to make this subtle distinction, but fostering the debate about magnificent liberality, at the end, they induced the production of an enormous amount of goods as well as services that were at the base of the most innovative, sectors of early modern production. So we can't forget the relationship between, century laws and magnificence, as well as, the introduction of new goods and services and the spur determined by magnificence. So again, if we don't look only at the theoretical aspect, but if we go through the daily mechanism of, for instance, economic production, it's clear that the dual model, magnificent and liberality, were at the base of this innovation process. So today we are obsessed with innovation, but the only way to keep the distance between the magnificent and the liberal was to innovate, introducing new materials, new patterns, and this is another positive result of the debate about magnificence. And I want to conclude my remarks mentioning funny examples. There is a marvelous letter that I found 20 years ago. It's a letter dated April 6, 1594. Well, the Grand Duke Ferdinando de' Medici was advising Zygmunt Báthory, which was a Hungarian counterpart, that his agent Cosimo Bottegari, which was traveling to Transylvania, was taking to him, and I'm quoting, some sables and lynxes, not those real ones that come from other parts, but those that art imitates in my bailiwick. And these were sent not because of their value, but because of their novelty. So we know that in 1594, the Medici were producing synthetic furs. So I don't want to launch a call to study a global history of synthetic furs. That might be a potential PhD topic. But again, if already in 1594 the Medici were studying how to produce synthetic furs, this is again a result of their obsession for magnificence. Because at that point, it was not enough having introduced, for instance, we have 2 dogs, a big one, and we have a caniche, a toy. So even Nausicaa dog was looking for something was going on. So, but it's the human part of webinars, so human or animal part of webinars.
And the nice thing is that the one dog from you, Guido, is reacted by Nausicaa's dog, so they are now communicating.
Marvelous. There is a beautiful community of pets communicating between Greece and Italy, and anyway, this is the final remark. So looking at Magnificent, is not limited to a marvelous philosophical debate or the intellectual fundamentals of 17th century ruling class mentality. Is something more. Is the central point from which new promising field of research could be opened. So this is the reason why I really appreciate the book. Apologies for my popular.
No, thank you. Thank you very, very much for those reflections. Those two new aspects, actually, to even more emphasize in future research. And I think that what you already mentioned, the liberalitas, in how far, because that's also one of the first questions, in how far is terribility, terribility the new magnificence? But actually, there were also in the Italian period and also in the 17th century 2 different concepts. Or how would you answer that question, Guido? Because I think that was reacting to your talk. Your sound is.
Oh, I've not understood. I was covered by my dog. There is a question.
So, in how far terribility, charitable, comes into with magnificence, and is it not also a new of showing modern or way, more modern concept?
Never found terribility well. I limited my research to the end of 16th century. I found the expression hero. So hero took place of magnificence, but terribility in my long-lasting research never appeared. Well, I'm talking about the end of 16th century. So.
All right. Thank you. Nafsika, the next question is for you, addressed to you. So when you say that providing clear water could become a contemporary form of showcasing magnificence, what would be the difference in the 17th century between caritas and magnificence?
Okay, I don't know, because I don't know about caritas. So I would love for you guys to tell me about the cultural context of caritas. But I think the general idea is that if you're looking for situated contextual expressions of magnificence, then you could see it in caritas in the 17th century, and you could see it today when we have people who don't have access to clean water and die because of it. But you could also see it back in Aristotle's times, when some theatrical aspects of the liturgies involved feeding the people. And what you saw was as important as what you ate. Mm-hmm. There was a charitable aspect, practically feeding people who didn't have enough food to eat while they watched the lovely play that you put on, and both were expressions of magnificence.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I can give the floor to Walter to more elaborate on that relation between caritas and magnificence, since you're, of course, also a specialist in religious theory.
Well, I think the point that Guido just made is an important point, that expenditure is extremely important to the expression of magnificence, because it's a way of, expenditure can also be magnificence and liberality, because expenditure is a way of distributing resources. And of course, charitable giving is a way of distributing resources. And I was really fascinated by the case of the Prince of Bracciano, who continues to spend an enormous amount on the apparatus of splendor, but he's doing it on credit. And precisely because he's doing it on credit, even though the apparatus looks just like the apparatus of any great prince, it doesn't seem to be efficacious anymore, because there isn't actually expenditure going. There is no expenditure undergirding the apparatus. There's an apparatus without the expenditure, because he can't afford to spend. He can only borrow, but he cannot make good on his debts. And it goes to show, I mean, if expenditure is fundamental to the producing an effect of magnificence, which I think it was for the Bracciani and for the cases that Guido brings up, then to the extent that charitable giving can be the result of massive expenditure, it can be symptomatic of magnificence. I mean, one of the ways in which the charitable and mere display for the sake of display, they intersect, and they intersect because of the importance of a system of expenditure.
Thank you. I think that Nele makes Nele de Raad makes a nice addition. Could we conceptualize the difference between charity and magnificence in that charity can imply pure giving, while magnificence always results in making something, the facere? Maybe Nafsika, or going back to Aristotle?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting distinction in itself. Guys, I'm limited here because I'm centuries before the issues you look at, but in Aristotle, there is no, as far as I know, express discussion of charity or benevolence or kindness. These are not identified as virtues or obligations in any way. We have to read these more modern concepts into Aristotle. Do you think there's a case to be made that the way Aristotle talks about magnificence, there are a lot of links with how we understand charity or benevolence? But I do really like this point that charity becomes a wider concept of purely helping, purely giving, whereas magnificence is always tunneled through the idea of making something. That's very interesting, yeah.
Gijs, can you add on the discussion?
Yes, well, I can relate on it in relation to Nierenberg. He says charity is the basis of all the virtues in a sense of charity of love for all people as an expression of love for God, and also to magnificence. But of course, especially if you take into account certain expenditures, if you take into account the expenditures on the foundation of schools and new churches, especially schools, Jesuit schools, which also gave the possibility to for poor people to receive education. In that sense, magnificence comes very close to charity, I think.
But then, of course, the difference isn't it that pointed out by Aristotle that everyone can be charitable, but not everyone can be magnificent? It's all about the amount of spending, Nafsika?
I have this slight worry with calling liberality charity. But charity as a term, I think, has other connotations that are added to it later on that aren't quite there in liberality. But I think it's an interesting question to ask. What are the connections between the two? And to what extent liberality is our modern concept of charity and magnificence is an extra obligation? Interesting. I don't know. You guys are leaving me with loads of thoughts and loads of exciting ideas for the future.
Right. That's actually a very good point to end this book presentation. I would like to thank everyone of you, everyone here. We were with 130 people, so that's great. But also everyone who spoke today, all authors again. Thank you very, very much. I really enjoyed having the thoughts on the book again. So I hope to see you all live once or really quickly, but let's see about that. Thank you very much, and see you at the next book launch. That's Amy Galani's book on the Italian influence of Rembrandt. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, thank you. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.